Hi, welcome to my altered set card review for the Lyra characters and heroes. The Lyra faction is the music and art faction that also is the gamblers. And the first character here is the gambler Nevenka. You roll a die and you get anchored, a boost, or reserve at random. There's some spicy outcomes that happen from the anchored and reserve outcomes, but those are the rare outcomes, and most of the time Nevenka is just giving you a boost. And that boost that Nevenka is getting you is at a timing similar to Basira, where you can put it wherever you want it. In some ways, it's even more flexible than Basira because you don't have to play a card that produces a boost. But it's not fully more flexible than Basira because you do have to pick something which you want to jeopardize, you're okay jeopardizing the life of, because it might go to reserve. Or it might get anchored. I think Nevenka and Blotch is really close to the card advantage hero that we're going to see in a second. Nevenka and Blotch reminds me of Teja in that there's a card draw hero in her same faction, and her quality compared to that card draw hero seems like really, really close, neck and neck. And it's not hard to imagine ways to leverage this ability to get advantages that feel just as good as cards. But since Lyra doesn't have huge numbers on their characters to begin with, where I think only one boost will be enough to win games on Brawn, I prefer the approach that lets you use more cards to try to leverage some kind of tricksy advantage. And for that reason, Nevenka is my second favorite, but I still like her a lot. I also think that if the card Small Step, Giant Leap seems to be, if that card pans out as being as powerful as it might be, Nevenka might be the strongest of all 18 heroes at utilizing that specific card. And that could jump her up to being one of the most focused characters in the game if that was the case, I think. Because she has a stronger ability for getting the first 6 advancements and doesn't have Fen's strange interaction with resupplying it. So I'm going to give Nevenka and Blotch a B. And next we will look at Arak and Kibble. Arak and Kibble also has an exciting interaction with Small Step, Giant Leap, but is very unlikely because Arak plays about 1 free card per game. Every time you play a character with base statistics 0, you get a performance counter. It's not each base statistic 0, it's a character with any base statistics of 0 at all. And in practice, I found this to be about 1 time per game. It hasn't even seemed like I could change the deck building to reliably get 2 per game. One random character once per game is going to be on average like a 3/3/3 that is in a fixed location similar to a Buddha token. So kind of on average, this is looking similar to someone who is worse than Buddha on worse than Kojo on every single turn of the game except 1, which is not a great outlook. There's the plan of putting lots of Shenlongs in your deck and hoping to hit Shenlong, but I think you want better reliable outcomes and better average outcomes. And even if you hit the highest possible outcome, your opponent might use removal because you had to use this so early in the turn and might still get a 1/1. Or they might just play to the opposite lane because they get so much information early from this ability being locked to noon. So I think Arak and Kibble is a very, very tough sell. For that reason, I'm going to give her a D. And we'll have to see if I'm surprised on that. Fen and Crowbar causes you to draw 3 cards instead of 2 and put 1 into mana, 1 into reserve, and 1 into your hand, instead of putting 2 into your hand and then deciding if anything anywhere in your hand wants to go to mana. This means she can never draw a card that isn't situationally good and put it into mana ever, which relates to that small step interaction I was mentioning earlier. If she draws a small step, it might be an extra card but if it was in the resupply, but she can't get it into mana at all. So if she draws 2 small step per game, the second one is worthless. Even if she draws 1 and it's too early, she's probably designed to need like tons of cards early on, so she might get frustrated by that. So she's not the best small step hero. She is the best Lyra Festival hero, probably. Nevenka can occasionally anchor something with her ability, but if you draw a ton of cards, you can just draw your cards that anchor too. And Fen and Crowbar having more card resources overall can get this sort of pseudo card selection where you're just like playing one of your cards repeatedly because you resupplied it multiple times or because you're picking it back up with Hathor. And then that makes your hand start to fill up with options the more you play these cards from reserve or are playing cards you bounced from reserve. And that's going to be able to set you up to do the Lyra Festival combo if you want. It could also set you up to repeatedly remove your opponent's characters and just win on biome stats. Or it could set you up to use cards like Twinkle Twinkle late in the game over and over again and never let things wake up. So she has lots of ways to attack on different axes, and a lot of those axes don't necessarily care that her characters are a little smaller because she doesn't have a buff counter like some here, a boost counter like some characters. So I'm cautiously optimistic that she is slightly better than Nevenka. It's also very important to probably use lots of zero cost support abilities with her to make sure you're getting value from her effect every turn and not having to discard cards from reserve meaninglessly. So I'm going to give her an A, and we will see how she pans out. Martingale. It's a 1/1 for a 1/1/0, and you get the next card you play this turn costs 1 less as a support ability. The support ability is not very good in Nevenka because Nevenka's gonna have a normal amount of half cards, and I think generally with a normal amount of half cards, you don't want to convert a reserve card into a mana. And that might be especially true if it's a 1-cost card, which especially in a faction that doesn't have many. This is Lyra's only 1-cost card. However, I think Fen will really enjoy the next card you play this turn costs 1 less, because although she may dream of getting even more out of every single card than that, she's not a very consistent hero, and if she is having an awkward curve and that her reserve is at risk of getting clogged, this is a great way to resolve the issue of a clogged reserve because it gets rid of itself, and then it might also give you enough mana to play something out from your reserve. So this is going to be an A. Just having 2 biome stats and a cost of 1 might have made it an A to start with, but it's an A. This is the dice-themed Martingale, the rare one. If you would roll a die, you may add 1 to its result. Choose after you see the result. Fen probably isn't playing so many cards that reference dice that she wants to play this, but Nevenka adds any cards to this that she wants and then already has her ability that is keying off of this. This is an entire rare point though, so I'm a little wary of spending an entire rare point for a card that occasionally doesn't do anything if you roll like a 3, but also isn't really adding more multi-dimensionality to your deck. Like, spending this rare point doesn't fix your curve. It doesn't give you access to an effect from another faction you normally don't have. It just makes a roll a little bit better. I'm going to give this a B, maybe a high B. I do really like that this is a rare point we can spend in Nevenka, and every single time we draw this rare point, we're probably going to get it into play, and we're probably going to get it into play twice. That aspect of it is attractive, and this is maybe a little bit more than 1 boost worth of stats. If you have a card play plus the ability. No, it probably breaks even at 1 boost of stats. But we'll say this is a B because I like that it is consistently being used. I'm thinking about it more. I'm going to C. I'm influenced by a lot of people having a high opinion of the rare, but I think my own personal opinion is that I'm much more impressed by some cost-changing rares than some out-of-faction rares. Lyra Thespian. If you have 3 or more base statistics of 0 among characters you control, I gain 1 boost. This card is interesting because I think it's a 2/2 for 2 that is a little less appealing than a lot of the other 2/2 for 2s we've seen. Like, the special ability is a little harder to use than red. It's a little harder to use than a couple of the others. But a 2/2 for 2 is still really good. For the most part, the character with 2 zeros isn't that great. And the really good character with 3 zeros is Ouroboros Trickster, which I think will be 3 of in every single deck. So it's kind of funny that you're probably not going to use the among part of this. You're probably mostly just going to hit specifically the Trickster with this. But a 2/2 for 2 is just very solid to start with. So I'm going to give this a... give this a B. I think this is probably usually one of our commons. Lyra has a lot of cards with zeros in the costs, so I think you might have to play this. I think after set 2 comes out, I would be surprised if there wasn't a replacement for this that was better. But I think this is probably a good idea to help have more characters with non-zero in all of their stats. This rare is a D. I don't think you should do this. I think even in Iraq and Kibble, it's probably a better idea to make some of your best 0 costs that you're like always playing every time you draw them, like the Trickster herself. Spend your rare point on that probably. I think it's a pretty marginal bonus to get a conditional boost. Ouroboros Trickster. Roll a die. Half the time it's a 1/1/1, half the time it's a 2/2/2. So the exciting thing about her is that she only costs 1 the second time, and she can be a 1-cost 2/2/2 the second time. This is appealing in It's appealing in all three factions, or all three characters. And people like to feature this art a lot, and it's really cool that it has a dynamic with all three characters from the first set of the game. But with the Rock and Kibble, it plays with the Lyra Thespian, which is probably going in your deck. Well, maybe not. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't play the Thespian in Rock and Kibble actually. But it does have a 0 statistic for Rock and Kibble. It's hard to remember that a Rock and Kibble does not get 3 performance counters from this. She gets 1. So this works in a Rock and Kibble. This works in Fen because Fen will directly access that 1 reserve cost sometimes. And then it works in Nevenka because Nevenka is more likely to include the cards in her deck that modify dice rolls or benefit from dice rolls because she already has a dice roll. So it fits in all 3. This is an A. I think this is better on average as a 2/2/2 for 2, even if you put a curse on this card that Fen never directly resupplied it. But barely, slightly. But once you remove that curse, and sometimes you just resupply this and have this amazing 1 cost 1/1/1 or 2/2/2, I think it's a really exciting card. And I think Nevenka will have enough dice rolling synergies to run it, even though it's a little weaker for her. This one removes the super cheap cost and then gets you 3 boosts, but only on the high roll. I think it makes players feel very rewarded if they added lots of rare Martingales and Ouroboros Bastions to their deck. But getting more stats and then paying the mana cost that is owed to those stats is just not really what you expect out of a rare point. So I'll give this one a D. Hathor. You can, as a support ability, return another card from reserve to your hand. The rare costs 2 to play from reserve, which you can only do if you don't do the support ability. So I'm going to rate that a D. I think a support ability that's really good appearing alongside a cost reduction is kind of a draft chaff thing that I don't think the developers are trying to make a hard sell on. But the common is, I think it's a pretty good common. So you have Frog Prince stats the first time you play it, and you're not going to have to play it a second time. So just Frog Prince stats, except these are better than Frog Prince stats if you don't have to do them twice. A lot of the struggle with Frog Prince is you find one biome where you can live, and it's like, cool, I played a good character. And then all the characters advance to the biomes where Frog Prince can never live. And then after that, the game is going to end, and you're like, wow, this Frog Prince had fleeting. So she doesn't have that problem. Instead of her having fleeting if everyone wanders into water, you can return another card from your reserve to your hand. If it's a good card, that could mean that you're playing it 3 times this game, or it could mean that you're playing a card that you would have played 1 time, 2 times if it's Fen. It could also just return a card you played once that you never want to play again and put it into mana. But only Nevenka and Harok can do that. Fen cannot do that. But Fen will be happy to play cards that got directly into reserve over and over again. And Fen will also be happy that this is like a cheap character she can play, and then the next turn she can easily keep her reserve clean. Like she can keep the total number of cards she has access to high without hitting the reserve limit, because this removes Hathor herself and removes 1 other card. So I'm going to give Hathor an A. And this is a really good, I think this is a pretty good special effect to get at common. It is not a game-breaking special effect. You're paying a half card and getting a half card. But I think it's a good bit of deck manipulation, and you're not paying that much biome stats. Speaking of paying that much biome stats, Lyra's Scald has no ability and 1 point worse stats than the card we just saw. It's possible that you have to play this anyway, but we just saw a 2-cost 2/2/2. We're probably playing that sooner. And if I recall correctly, yeah, this isn't that much better. You can discard half a card to get half a card, which is card selection, and it does let Fen completely get rid of cards that she doesn't like at all and get something new, which she, as mentioned before, she cannot do with the mana zone like other characters can. But I think it's a hard sell to spend an entire rare point for that. This character itself is not a great character, so it's kind of like spending a rare point to discard one of your bad commons and try to find a good rare instead of just adding a good rare to your deck and then immediately getting a good rare because you drew that good rare because you put it in your deck instead of Lyra Scald. So all that said is why I don't like Lyra Scald and the rare form. The supportability is good enough for a common, but I'm not sure about rare. The common, I could maybe see you running 1 or 2 to get 3 forests. Or does Hathor have 3 forests? Hathor has 3 forests. Let's just give this a D, and let's just say we're going to not need to play this card, and we're gonna hope this card's mandatory inclusion in the Lyra deck is the reason that deck isn't that good. Let's believe. I think it's in the Lyra deck. Tanuki. This also has 3/3/0, but it's a sabotage character. Is this the same stats? It's the same stats as Hathor, so including this has a little bit of tension with Hathor. And that they want the same biomes. And I think this is the same stats as Hatter, which I really want to play. Hatter is also asking to play on these biomes. Those things make me hesitant to play the Tanuki. There's a lot of cards I'm more excited about that are doing the same biome stats. It might be hard to play sabotage characters in Fen because you can't opt out of them. And sabotage can be a situationally powerful effect. Also, this is a hand ability, so sometimes it whiffs for Fen for that reason. This should be a bit more powerful in Nevenka. Lyra has some sabotage, or not sabotage. Lyra has some removal, but not amazing removal. So removing some like really powerful creatures could help Nevenka tie together an aggressive biome stat plan and try to remove the few things that could get better biome stats than her boost. So I'll give this a D still on the screen. This isn't a D. We'll say this is a C. And we'll see if Nevenka would like to use it in spite of the competition with Hatter and Hathor. I will say I'm not going to comment on Iraq specifically a lot. Part of that because I don't really think she's even like a starting point for building compelling decks, but also because I do think she's pretty similar to the others, because you don't have to add a ton of zeros to get 1 performance per game in my experience, and you still want to play good cards and just win expeditions. I don't think you should put like tons of expensive cards in your Arok deck and then expect to get lucky when you use the ability. I think you should put cheap cards in your rock deck and then not be behind on expeditions so that using your ability and hitting a 0-4-4 is actually game winning because you're not 4 expeditions behind. So Tanuki here having a 0, it doesn't really require a comment because his role in Nevenka is going to be similar to his role in Auroch. Ouroboros Inkcaster. When I go to reserve from the expedition zone, you may return another card from reserve to your hand. And this one is cheaper, but you lose a little bit of biome stats. I'll give this Ouroboros Inkcaster. Oops. I'll give this one a B. It is possible to have a sequence where there's like nothing in reserve to return to your hand. Or occasionally a card in reserve that you want to leave there. But this is generally a pretty useful ability. And including this card gives you a little bit of extra non-zero characters in your deck, which is kind of nice. Specifically, it is a 3-cost card with all 3 biome stats. And something I like about 3-cost cards with all 3 biome stats, and Lyra specifically, is that the starting expeditions always care about all 3 stats. So if we're pessimistic about our ability to find a 2-cost and a 1-cost card that both have 1 biome in each stat, or 1 stat in each biome, then just having a singular 3-cost card that hits all the biomes might be the best way to play the first turn of the game without playing a character that is polarized in the way that's bad for the first biome of the game. So I like Ouroboros Inkcaster for that reason, and I also like Cernunnos and Alice for that reason. Those are rares. This one is a common. So I think that's pretty appealing. This one is, I think Nevenka might not want to pay this rare point, but Fen might. Or maybe they both do. But you do lose a little bit of stat points off the forest and mountain, and that might matter. And then you get this reserve ability that is a lot stronger in Fen than Nevenka. Nevenka probably is just going to appreciate that this costs 2 the second time she plays it. I think that the way the special effect ends up working in Fen, where Fen has so many things in reserve she needs to clean up to not discard, makes this the rare version in A. And then in Fen, she also has the panic button of using that reserve ability to fix clunky hands. And this is an additional 2/2/2 for 2. You don't usually want to pay a rare point to get that, but Fen decks may have to because of so many 0 stats being in Lyra. Another 0 stat in Lyra, Esmeralda. Esmeralda resupplies when you play her from hand, and then no effect from reserve. This card doesn't directly play into any themes for Nevenka, but drawing half a card is just kind of good in any deck. And then this is very clunky in Fen. Fen is trying to figure out what to do with all of the cards she's resupplying, so she's not trying to create more of that burden. It's possible that Fen decks get so good at converting reserve to some kind of benefit that they weirdly want this, but I would expect that to start happening in set 2. I think Esmeralda will be, let's say, a B. It's nice that she has different stats from the Forest Mountain. We've seen that Forest Mountain seems to be the most common 0 stat available. She is big enough to contend on half of the biomes and then have a special ability. She's kind of like that concept of a 2/2/2 for 2 with a special ability, except she can't play half the biomes. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't want a full 3 copies, because I found when I draw multiple Esmeralda, like one of them is hard to play. But I think this is a good special ability for not too much of a stat dip. This Esmeralda seems significantly worse. We'll say D. I'm surprised there aren't additional biome stats here, but this is pretty much, this is like you may pay 1 to resupply, and I insist that you do so on the second play, right? Like on Aloe Vera, except Aloe Vera also stayed in play longer. I don't think gaining the privilege of paying 1 mana for resupply, it is something you would pick if it was on a different common, but I don't think it's something you would pay a rare point to do. Also, increasing the cost of the card can make it harder to clear your reserve after you flooded it with Esmeralda in the first place. Lyra Navigator. You get 4 in 1 stat and 0 everywhere else. The back half of this is 3, even though it kind of seems like it would be fair if the back half of this was just another 2. I'm going to give this a D, because I'm skeptical this works out most of the time. The pitch of this card might be that you can frequently advance together with your opponent on the 3 biomes that have, or the 2 biomes that have water and another stat. I think advancing together with your opponent on a biome is really, really bad to plan to do. I usually find that I lose games where I did that, and it's really hard to do that a couple times and then like somehow be in an advantage position. This is really cool on the water only biome, but it's actually possible to not even play that biome a single time during the game if both players win the game on that biome, or if you draw this card after it's been passed. All kinds of things can keep that from happening. This is it's very funny how often in the reviews I say that I would like a certain effect on the common, and then the rare version gives that effect, and then I say, well, I'm not willing to pay a rare point to get that effect. So this is a D. I think if the common was 2 and then 2 again, it might still be a D. The resupply support ability is a nifty ability, but not moving the needle a huge amount. Anansi. I gain 1 boost for each card in your reserve. So Fen can make this a 5/5/5. Doesn't count your opponent's reserve. I made a mistake about that in the Axiom video. But Fen can make this a 5/5/5 for 3. But it's not a 5/5/5 for 3 she can play on the first turn and maybe not the second turn. However, a lot of openings on the first turn will let you get away with a 2/2/2 for 3. If they're the kinds of openings where your opponent's just spreading a little bit of stats to each expedition. Possibly even when going first, if your opponent just doesn't have the 3/3/3 for 3 in hand. Well, no, they would just play their 2-drop and their 1-drop together. So you need to be going second for this to do well the very first turn. But oh wait, no, this is a 3/3/3 for 3 the first turn. Okay, so this is an A. Yeah, if even the fail case in Fen is that this is a 3/3/3 for 3 common. That's kind of something to write home about in Lyra in some ways, but the fact that it can be a lot better than that is what's exciting. This one loses 2/2/2 of stats and then gains 2/2/2 of stats because it starts counting your opponent's reserve. It'd be an edge case for your opponent to resupply and be gaining 3/3/3 of stats. The idea here is that you're paying a rare point for a performance counter. I don't think even in Iraq you should actually pay an entire rare point for a performance counter. I think you'd be better off like adding an additional 0 stat 1-drop to your deck or something. Lyra Cloth Dancer. Up to 1 target character gains fleeting and the same stat profile as Lyra Scald, but you're getting a powerful special effect. This special effect it's a little bit more powerful than Sabotage, because your opponent cannot use the first player token to play the character before you get a chance to sabotage it. It just goes away immediately. This Lyra Cloth Dancer hits all characters from one player with fleeting. I don't really like the common Lyra Cloth Dancer. Although the effect is stronger than Sabotage, the stats are pretty poor, and you do have to time the effect. So even though the best case outcome is better than Sabotage, it's possible that the flexibility level is lower than Sabotage because the thing you want to sabotage is still in your opponent's hand, and you have the first player token during the turn. That mountain stat is really good. And then there could be cool things in reserve you would like to hit instead, but then this isn't Sabotage, so it's not as flexible. The rare version is a massive amount of half cards removed, especially against Waru, because Waru can sleep a bunch of characters. So it can be even more characters than is normal for a hero to have in play. Something I've noticed from seeing people post their uniques is that there's a lot of uniques with this special ability that have it as a support ability, and that might be more appealing than paying a mana cost to trigger the ability, because the support ability lets you wait until really late and use this when the maximum number of things are getting hit. I don't want to grade it based on those specific uniques, because the average person just might not own one. So let's say that we can't actually use those. If we can't actually use those, this is really good against Waru. But against everyone else, these stats are really devastating, and quite a few other characters have a way to recover from losing so many half cards. Ortis can draw 2 Ozma and then say, you know what, I'm not going to mana zone either of these Ozma because my opponent lost 2 lanes playing Lyra Cloth Dancer to remove a lot of my characters, and then just draw cards back up. I would be worried about those kinds of things happening in general. So without consideration to those uniques, I will give this a low C still. And I do think this is an interesting game plan that might be its own deck, but it's probably going to be based on those seemingly very, very high population uniques if it's executed, because these stats are so low. Sandman. Up to 1 target character gains a sleep. When Fen resupplies this, she's a little sad because there's no ability and these aren't amazing stats. But a sleep is really powerful. You may play this in Fen anyway and just bounce it to hand. Actually, you almost certainly play this in Fen anyway if you are going for the Lyra Festival strategy, which I think you probably should do. The rare resupplies better, especially if you're not trying to use Lyra Festival. You could just not bother bouncing this back and just have a good stats card. Just try to win expeditions. I will give the basic Sandman an A. I think between this being like a 7/7/7 for 3 on the last turn in the sense of the ceiling and the best case scenarios for the Asleep, that's one good thing. Turning on the Lyra Festival is another good thing, and I like not spending a rare point to do it, because in many cases you have to. And also 3/3 stats for 3. You can find spots where that is going to work. There's 3 biomes where this works, whereas when you saw the 0/3/2 stat line, there's a lot fewer biomes that don't at least invoke that 2. So I like this Sandman. This Sandman gives you 2 boosts only on one of the plays, only if you sleep your own thing, only if the game lasts that long, only if you're not winning with Lyra Festival. It's kind of enough things that I don't really want to do it. You do get the 2-cost 0/3/3 if you resupplied it directly in Fen, but that happens exactly half the time. And I think that's not a big enough percentage of the time to actually spend the rare point here. Lyra Chronicler. 3-cost for a 4/04. This is one of the stat distributions on 0-cost characters I like the most. It may be that playing vanilla 0-stat characters is not the best angle, but maybe it is the best angle. It does give you an edge on how many stats you're presenting per mana on your opponent if you have the right biomes. The rare is on an entirely different page, so it'll be tricky to look at, but if I remember correctly, it only adds the resupply supportability. Oh dear, why isn't it not showing me? This is Lyra Chronicler. Oh, okay. Yeah, it just adds the resupply supportability. I think that supportability is not worth a full rare point. So let's say this one is a D. It is nifty, and it lets you swap her out for a different card in Fen if you don't like her, but I think it's better to spend rare points to have the cool cards in hand you could have played instead. I think 4/04 is generally going to be good enough stats, and you want some 3-costs in your deck. So I'm going to give this a B. And I think it's a pretty good common. Ouroboros Croupier. Roll a die on a 4+ draw a card on a 1/3 resupply. And then the rare version is 0/5/5 and then has the cost reduction effect. This is a die roll for cards that care about die roll. So Nevenka may like that, but the 4-cost 0/4/4 stats is not very appealing. We just saw a 3-cost 0/4/4 stats, and a 4-cost character is already kind of needing to sell you on things because 3-cost and 2-cost characters are a lot more flexible, and if you play them twice, you don't really run out of things to do with your mana. But this does let you see more cards per game and play more cards per game. I'm going to give the Croupier a D. I think I would rather play... I think I'd rather play Esmeralda and Nevenka. That's my initial impression. I've seen a lot of people run the Ouroboros Croupier, but I think because 4/4 for 0/4/4 is worse than 2/2 for 0/2/2 and several other things in the rest of your build, I think you'll generally pass this up. And then I think there's a similar situation with this, getting a fair amount of rare points added onto it, and then getting the panic ability in Fen is good, but I don't think you need to bend over backwards spending rare points to find it if you don't find many. You can just play some extra cheap cards if you don't have enough of this support ability. So I'm going to give them both a D. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe you played a less than 3 count of them for the 4 in mountains specifically. It would be interesting. Hatter. Hatter is a 5/5/0, and it costs 5 the second play, but you usually won't have to do that because Hatter can discard from reserve to anchor something with cost 3 or less. I've gushed about the anchored cost 3 or less ability in Muna, and nothing special about Lyra is going to make it stop being great. And I think getting 5/5/0 for 4 is a pretty good deal when we're not spending a rare point for it. It's a little less good than Kappa, but then the support ability is way better than Kappa asking you to play him yet again. The rare is not good, as I remember. The rare moves the stat points around, which is a very funny joke, but the rare is a D. And the reserve cost is cheaper, but you don't actually use the reserve cost. This Hatter is going to be an A. I think it would get there just on stats, but it's also completely essential for a Lyra Festival deck because it both provides the anchored keyword ability itself, and it also can have you go into a turn with more characters in play, which makes it easier to set up the festival. Especially if that character is fleeting and you can't find a fleeting character to play. Amale, as Garthan Outcast, you may discard a card from your reserve to draw a card. 5 cost 5/5/5. The rare is to do that more times onto more cards. So this card is clearly intended for Fen, and Fen is the most likely to have cards in the reserve that are not desirable. But I think a 5 cost 5/5/5 is a 5 cost 5/5/5 is the bad card that you would want to discard from your reserve to draw a card. So I don't think you want to play a card that is the bad card that you would want to discard from your reserve to draw a card, just to discard a card from your reserve to draw a card. I think Amale is a D. History may prove that I'm too skeptical of 5 cost 5/5/5s. But my initial impression of the game is that this is a poor enough stat rate that it's a mistake to play this, and you're committing to playing a bad card when you remove the bad card from your reserve with this ability. Asmodeus. Roll a die. On a 4+, I gain anchored. On a 1-3, I gain 3 boosts. This has the same stats as Shenlong when you get 1-3. But then if you get anchored, either you want anchored and that's cool, or you don't want anchored and that's not cool. A lot of the times you probably won't want anchored because if you committed 6 mana for a 5/5/5, that lane might not be like secure. Adding 5/5/5 to a lane when your opponent has 6 mana to deal with it probably doesn't quite lock up the lane, while 8/8/8 probably would. And then what that would mean is that maybe you risk a 6/3/3 on one side and then a 1/1 on the other side this turn, and then not actually converting the 2/0 the next turn off the anchor. This gets better with... This actually doesn't This can't get boosts more if you use the Martingale. But if you use Ouroboros Bastion, you can pick whether you want boosts. I think this is a D. I think Navenka will either decide that she really likes the rare Asmodeus, or will just pass on the idea of Asmodeus entirely. And then it's pretty easy to imagine that Fen would not like to resupply this and have to figure out how to get a use out of it on short-term notice, the way her deck works. This one is 5 cost for 4/4/4. It's a little better ratio. Oh, misclick. Oh dear. Five cost for 4/4/4. A 7/7/7 is more likely to win against 5 mana than an 8/8/8 is to win against 6 mana. But I'm not sure this is actually where your rare point goes. I'll give this Asmodeus a C. I think Navenka might like it. Loki. Each player discards their hand, then draws 3 cards. At rare, the reserve is also included. This is a D. I think I've mentioned before, I think expeditions are very fungible to cards and to other advantages in a way where other games' win condition progress is less fungible because of how you can distribute your biome stats onto one specific lane once you know your goals have changed. So when characters are understated, I take that seriously, and 7 for 5/5/5 is pretty understated. So I'm not easily convinced that I'm going to draw the cool cards or even disrupt my opponent's cards, so much so that it is worth losing expedition progress. Is this the start of Out of Factions? This is where the Out of Factions start. So to make sure I don't forget, I'm going to review the Out of Factions that were on the first page. First is Tinkerbell. She sabotages from reserve, which works with Tanuki, or works a little better than Tanuki with Fen. I'm going to give Tinkerbell a D because I think she's not really so much better than Tanuki that you don't just play your in-faction common. I guess if you play both, you might end up playing her. I don't see that off the bat. Dr. Frankenstein. You may activate the arrow triggers of target permanent you control. This is a D. I don't think Brassbug Hive is in this faction, and the next best thing to Brassbug Hive is it's like a single boost or something. So this card just doesn't really have text until later sets. It is a 2-cost 3/3/3. Wait. Is it 2-cost 3/3/3 if Fen resupplies it directly? Nah, it's still only half the time. Fen can't move it from hand to reserve very easily, actually. Still a D. I now get what they were going for here, though. And that's actually pretty crazy in Fen if we later get a strong arrow permanent. Bravo's Pathfinder. Bravo's Pathfinder is on a hiking trip, and she brought candy, which is bonkers. Also, I learned when I was a kid that it's really unsafe to be doing athletic activity while using a sucker that doesn't have a rounded handle because, I wonder if you play this game with your kids, tell them not to do this actually. For real, I've heard that it can be dangerous because you can choke if you fall on the sucker. But the devs probably weren't thinking super hard about misinforming the youth. Would have just liked to see one of the safety suckers in this art. Anyway, this has 3/3 in mountain and forest and a 0 stat. This is the kind of stat profile that feels better than Lyra Scald that we would be happy to play as a common. But as a rare, this is probably a D, probably not quite making the cut. I think it'd be really cool if someone decided that like one copy of this for the forest and not the forest, for the mountain and water stat specifically was worth it. But that's not my initial thing to do. Kappa, 4/4, 5 for 4. I like having access to more rounded stat characters in Lyra, but I'm going to give this a D because cheaper cards are generally preferred, and Lyra already has access to some cool ways to use 4 mana, like the Mad Hatter. And like, I guess maybe Ouroboros Croupier is what you play if you want more than 3 copies of 4-cost characters. But you can also just not play 4-cost characters. And I'm excited about Hatter. Oh, this is also a 4-cost character that's more exciting. When I leave the expedition zone, you may put me in my owner's mana zone. I'm going to give Mighty Djinn an A, even though you might have so many rare point spends this doesn't get in. But I think it seems like a really cool way to spend your rare point in Fen specifically. Because you're drawing way more cards than most other characters, including the half draws. And having more mana to play more of those cards lets you convert those cards into biome statistics and then win biome statistics. And that's really appealing overall. If you resupply it directly, it's a Lyra Navigator, which is still cool. So we'll give this an optimistic A. Maybe it pans out a little worse than I hope, but we'll see. It's very hard to evaluate. Shenlong, 6 cost for 8/8/8. I think Lyra likes this effect more than Bravos does, but liking it more than Bravos does might not be enough for you to spend an entire rare point on it. I'll give this a C. I think Nevenka can... This is a cool way if Nevenka wants to build up cards in hand, or it's a good way to build up cards in hand in Iraq for sure, because you might hit it off the ability. And probably not playable at all in Fen because high cost cards are so disruptive in Fen. But I think every time you play an entire turn with just this 1/8/8/8, a lot of the situational cards that are really tempting in Lyra but could bite you, you get way more latitude to like slowly mana zone those or procrastinate playing them if you play a single card that covers an entire turn like this. And that's what makes it attractive to me in Lyra specifically. Tomoli goes in. It can't be played if you have less than 6 mana orbs. This is probably not quite worth the rare point. Lyra does have more of a shortage of decent characters, which makes it more appealing to include a card like this that's not really fancy and just is a few stats in a condition that's pretty easy to meet. But I think they're not quite that hard up for characters. Kybera as Garthan Leviathan. Gigantic and Tough X, where X is the number of regions between your hero and companion. This Tough ability has this fascinating dynamic where if you were trying to throw the game just so that you had more time to use the Lyra Festival, Or maybe you're accidentally throwing the game because you're playing cards like Esmeralda to find Lyra Festivals. The Tough X would get bigger, and then you'd be able to block your opponent's advancements better with this card. That is pretty interesting. Unfortunately, it doesn't directly trigger the Lyra Festival at all. And also, unfortunately, it may be possible to outclass a 6/6/6 Gigantic, especially if you just need a 1/1. Navenka can spread the boost counter to like both halves of this, which is appealing. Overall, this is probably a D. It probably doesn't make it, but I wish it did. It's just very expensive, even in a non-Fen deck, to run characters that you cannot play at any time, like an 8 cost. Okay, so that's where we were with the page 1 cards. Let's jump to the page 2 cards, starting with Kodama. When played from hand, Kodama gains a sleep, and then you have the Anchored Reserve ability. This has both halves of the Lyra Festival strategy, and then it has a 0 mana support effect that helps Fen, even if Lyra Festival isn't involved at all. So I think this is an A card. I think it's really appealing in non-Festival Fen and Festival Fen. The other characters might not go as crazy for this, although it's okay in Navenka. The first side isn't great in Navenka, but the support abilities, it's a very strong support ability. Yangsu, Verdant Weaver. If you have 3 or more base statistics of 0 among characters you control, I gain 2 boosts. So this could be a 5/5/5 twice, but you either need to play 3 characters, or play 2 characters and be a fan of Lyra Navigator, or have specifically the Ouroboros Trickster. I think a card that hits slightly above average stats for your rare point, specifically with Ouroboros Trickster, is just falling a little bit short. So I'm going to give this a D. I'm not quite willing to do this. If Fen had additional selection and not just additional advantage, I could maybe trust that she could just find the Trickster every single game. But she only flips her cards differently. She doesn't flip through them faster. Cernunnos, a 3-cost 4/4/4. Similar to Mighty Djinn, this is just really strong in a vacuum, really compelling in a vacuum, and gets an A even if special effects or specific tools might take the rare point away. Lyra really wants a turn 1 play, and this is a really good turn 1 play. You have to spend your rare point to get it, but you're getting a really reliable contender against other turn 1 plays. And this is also a good way to make cheap plays that just are big. Just have good biome stats. If you have access to more cards than your opponent because of Fen's ability, you can stay on the 2 and 3 cost cards for longer and then have more stats per mana. Because this has more stats per mana than, for instance, a Kappa. As if you look at like a big 9 mana turn with several cards played. Aloe Vera. You may pay 1 to have me gain Anchored, and at noon resupply. I'm going to give this an A. I mentioned before on Esmeralda that it was possible that Fen decks could get so geared and designed and optimized for using the resupplies that they would be willing to play Esmeralda. Here, that same concept is getting pushed out, but this also has a specific Lyra Festival interaction. And that Lyra Festival interaction is pretty important. Anchored is the most unavailable ability for the Lyra. Even on Mad Hatter in faction, it's on a delay. You have to get it into support first. So I really like getting an additional instance of Anchored here. I don't think it's that hard to use a resupply even in Fen. Navenka can gain Anchored and then put a boost counter on the Anchored. So I think Navenka likes it too. And 224 is a great stat line if you grade on a curve for Lyra. It does a lot better on turn 1 than the Lyra Navigator does. And then sometimes will perform, not Lyra Navigator, Lyra Chronicler. It's a lot better on turn 1 than the Lyra Chronicler, and then can do about as well on your other turns. But Lyra Chronicler doesn't have a special ability, so when this isn't quite as good as those stats, that's why. Coniferal Cone Man. This is not as appealing as the previous card. It's actually the same cost as the previous card. You just get different stats instead of the resupply. I'm going to just give it a D. The pitch for this card doesn't have quite enough stats, I think. Hydrocana. Lyra doesn't have the tools to protect this. Most of the tools to protect this were in Muna. And I don't actually have any reason to believe that Lyra would be the place to be trying to win off a Hydrocana. It does have 000 stats. That is funny, but it costs too much to combo with the cards that care about it. I guess in a rock, you're supposed to use it. It's probably not even correct in a rock, though. So I'm going to give it a D. 7-cost cards are really inflexible, and I don't see that full game plan that Muna could build where you guarantee that this is sticking to try to win games. Paper Herald. This is a standard 1-cost stat line, and you can create a token. Creating a token can help you do the Lyra Festival thing, because you need something to anchor with the Lyra Festival's ability to get all 3 abilities. And this is also a 1-cost card. It's also a 0-cost effect for Fen's ability, or for Fen's effort to keep her reserve small, to make sure she's getting something out of everything that gets resupplied. I'm still not sure I want to spend an entire rare point just to get more 1-drops. And the back half is, even if it might be free, it might cost 1. It's probably just another 1-drop. Let's say that this is a C. I think I'm more likely to play just like a ton of 2s in the Fen deck instead of playing extra 1s. Because even though the average mana cost wants to go down, I think there's something a little bit situational about 1-cost cards. Like, you want to play them first and see what your opponent is going to do, but then later in the turn, it becomes time to just like start playing some biome stats once you know what they're doing. Robin Hood. Characters your opponents play cost 1 more. This doesn't protect itself from spells the way the rare Ortis Robin Hood does. And there's an extra ability on here that Fen can use it to make cards cost less. This card doesn't do anything to forward the game plan of a Lyra Festival strategy. It forwards a biome-based game plan a little bit, but you have to find the specific biome for it. So I think you want to play this in a deck that's not focused on Festival very much. Maybe it could be good in both. Most cards are characters and not spells, so most of the time this does work. This is tricky for me to evaluate, but I think I'll give this a C. The biggest part of the difference isn't the characters versus spells difference. It's that Waru automatically uses this twice, and you're only using the effect once. And if you're going second, the number of cards that you tax might be like even less than half the cards Waru can tax. Studious Disciple. You got all sorts of ways to make the next spell cost one less. Spells are sometimes used in the big multi-action turns that a Lyra Festival goes off. But sometimes they aren't really involved in that. Sometimes it's just character plays and permanent plays. I think the Thopter card we looked at is a little better than this. So I'm going to say that I think this is a D. If you need to get this out of reserve on short notice, you might not necessarily have a spell, and you might not necessarily have a place a token can win, but you're more likely to have a place a token can help or win than a spell, I think. So I'm gonna say that we favor the Thopter, and the Thopter does better help for Lyra Festival combos. Khadgar and Mage Dancer. When you roll one or more dice, I gain one boost. I will give this an A for the role it tends to have in Nevenka. It's a 2/2/2 for 2, and then a 2/2/2 for 1. Already good enough. And then Nevenka plays some cards that trigger dice rolls to trigger this more. No matter how much you do or don't go all in on this, I think this is above rate in Nevenka specifically. So we're just going to give it an A for that. We like 2/2/2s that do something extra, and costing 1 the next time is easily sufficient for that. Alice. Alice is a 3/3/4 that you can play on the first turn, so she's really good at solving that first turn problem for a faction that has lots of zeros. And she also has a 0-cost support ability that is helpful, which Fen can really appreciate sometimes. Sometimes Fen might be playing so many cards that she doesn't need the help from the After You, but at least some of the time she'll need it, especially if she gets the first player token. You can also use this to protect a Lyra Festival combo. It's a really strong way to try to do the version where you get such a mana advantage on your opponent that they've spent down below removal mana costs before you start comboing. I'll give Alice an A. It is, however, not a unique tool, and if it gets crowded out for that reason, it's kind of a unique tool. It's not as unique as like permanent removal or something. So if the rare point spend just can't be had, it just can't be had. And how we have Flamel. You may return a spell from your reserve to your hand. A lot of spells have fleeting, so they're not going to get there. The weird thing is that in Fen, if you resupplied a fleeting spell and you returned it to your hand, you would kind of go, now what? Because you're not allowed to put it in mana, which is the only thing that would make it function differently if you played it from reserve. I think Nevenka doesn't have a whole lot of spells she wants to play. And I'm just not really sure. I'm not sure if there's a specific spell in the set we're supposed to get excited about, or if they just really needed to pick any of the 5 factions to try to give this to. But this is probably not it. 4 for 4/3/3 is not as good as some of the other stat characters that we've looked at. The backside is the same stats as Alice, which had a better support ability. I think After You is a significantly better support ability than cost 1 less. Because usually you force your opponent to spend more than 1 mana. Is one way of thinking about it. So I'll give Flammel a D. I want to put a premium on the rare point and put a premium on being 4 cost. I would play the Croupier sooner than this, I think. And that's all of them. I went a little bit faster at the end there, but also a lot of the out-of-factioners were a little simpler to evaluate, so I didn't feel like I had to rush way too much. The last video will be the spells and permanents for the Lyra faction. And it might be pretty important because you might want to play spells to finish out a Lyra deck with enough characters that aren't stressful to play because they have zeros. It's a lot better to just play a spell that removes your opponent's character instead of playing something like Lyra Scald and hoping it has the right biome stats. Because your opponent's character that you removed always has the right biome stats. That's why they placed them there. So I hope you tune into that video, and I hope you enjoyed this one, and have a great night.